April 9th, 1944. The Bay of Biscay. Dawn broke pale and colourless across the Atlantic horizon, the first rays of sunlight glinting off the steel hull of U-852, a Type 9D2 U-boat built for range, not survival. At the periscope, Kapitänleutnant Heinz-Wilhelm Eck, 31 years old, son of a Prussian officer and newly minted commander in the Kriegsmarine, scanned the empty waters. His men whispered prayers. They were weeks into a patrol already marked by exhaustion, dwindling fuel, and the uneasy knowledge that Allied eyes watched every movement from the sky. Eck had been promised glory when he accepted command of U-852 in November 1943. The Type 9D2 was the largest submarine Germany had yet committed to combat, an ocean-going leviathan displacing over 1,600 tons on the surface, stretching 87.6 metres bow to stern. She carried a crew of 66 men and enough provisions for 6 months at sea. Her mission? Break into the Indian Ocean and prey on Allied shipping lines bound for Egypt, India and Australia. She was to be the cutting edge of the Kriegsmarine's new strategy, expanding the war into waters once thought beyond German reach. But reality had crushed those illusions. By early 1944, the Atlantic had become a death trap for U-boats. Radar-equipped patrol bombers swept the Bay of Biscay night and day. Allied codebreakers had penetrated the Enigma cipher. Losses reached catastrophic levels. Nearly 80% of U-boats operating out of France never returned. Even the most loyal officers whispered that Karl Dönitz's grey wolves were now more prey than predator. And yet Eck, newly promoted, still carried the burden of Nazi expectations. Press releases spoke of him as a rising star, an officer destined to carve Germany's mark into the Indian Ocean. The first month at sea had shown him otherwise. Mechanical failures plagued the patrol. Saltwater corrosion ate into the ballast tanks. The diesel engines consumed fuel at alarming rates, leaving the men calculating distances with desperation. The crew's morale weakened. Food spoiled faster than expected in the humid tropical air. What remained turned their stomachs, black bread crawling with mould, tins of ersatz meat with grease hardened into lumps, potatoes sprouting shoots in the bilge. Fresh water was rationed to a single cup per man per day. The stench of sweat, diesel fumes and unwashed bodies clung to the steel hull like a curse. And then there was the decision that would define Eck's fate. On the night of March 13, 1944, U-852 encountered the Greek merchant steamer Peleus, 4,500 tons, steaming alone off the coast of West Africa. 2 torpedoes ended her voyage within minutes. Survivors clung to wreckage, calling for help in English and Greek. But Eck feared the wreckage would betray his position to Allied patrol aircraft at dawn. Against the unwritten traditions of the sea, and against the protests of some of his men, he ordered machine guns brought to the deck. For hours, U-852's crew hurled grenades, poured fire into rafts, and attempted to erase the evidence of the sinking. Some survivors died in the water. A few escaped. Their testimony would one day hang over Eck like a noose. Now, in April, the consequences of that order had not yet caught up with him. For the moment, survival consumed every thought. Allied aircraft prowled the skies over the Bay of Biscay. Depth charges had become a near-daily torment, forcing U-852 to dive deep, shut off engines, and drift silently in the cold black waters, while rivets groaned against the crushing pressure. Ex-officers recorded each encounter in their logbooks with chilling precision. April 2nd. Sighted 2 liberators, crash-dived, minor damage from depth charges. April 6th. Encountered Sunderland flying boat, strafed the conning tower, 2 wounded. April 8th. Near miss from depth charges, port engine misfiring. Each day chipped away at the U-boat's endurance. Each attack left more scars across her hull and her crew's confidence. Inside the pressure hull, the men's conversations turned grim. They knew the statistics. In January 1944 alone, 47 U-boats had been lost in the Atlantic. In February, 65 more. Survivors of sunken boats whispered that Allied radar could see through darkness, through fog, even through cloud. For ex-men, every surfacing for air was a gamble, every dive a prayer. They had become trapped in a war of mathematics, one Germany could not win. Eck tried to project confidence. He strode the decks with the air of command, barked orders with crisp authority, quoted Dönitz's speeches about German willpower and sacrifice. But in the dark hours between attacks, he confided to his first officer that they had sailed into an unwinnable ocean. His crew's survival depended not on skill, but on chance. On April 9, 1944, chance ran out. At 10:15 hours, as U-852 surfaced to recharge batteries near the coast of Somalia, the distinctive drone of Bristol Wellington bombers filled the air. These were not the lumbering patrols of 1940. These were Coastal Command strike aircraft, fitted with lee lights and radar, flown by crews hardened by years of anti-submarine warfare. Depth charges straddled the hull, explosions ripping through the pressure casing. U-852 shuddered as compartments flooded. Fires broke out in the diesel room. Men screamed in the darkness as pipes burst, spraying scalding steam. Eck ordered the impossible: beach the submarine. With engines failing and compartments filling, U-852 limped toward the Somali coast, grounded herself on a reef, and slid into silence. The crew scrambled ashore, dragging wounded men onto the sand, staring at the wreck of the boat they had called home. Eck, his uniform torn and his face smeared with oil, stood watching the smoke rise from the submarine that had carried him to both ambition and ruin. The last patrol of U-852 had ended not in triumph, but in wreckage on a foreign shore. Within hours, British patrols would capture the survivors. For Eck, captivity awaited. But unlike most German officers who would discover abundance, dignity, and even education in American camps, he carried into captivity a burden few men could bear: the memory of survivors machine-gunned in the water, and the certainty that his decisions would one day be judged not by the Reich, but by history. March 13, 1944, 1945 hours. South Atlantic, off the coast of West Africa. The sonar operator of U-852, a young radio man named Hans-Günther Behrens, pressed his headphones tighter against his ears. A faint echo had returned, metal on the surface, a solitary contact against the endless ocean background. Kapitänleutnant Heinz-Wilhelm Eck, pacing the control room with the restlessness of a man 3 months into a patrol, leaned over the chart table. The coordinates placed them in a remote stretch of sea, 500 nautical miles off Liberia, far from Allied convoy routes. It was luck, perhaps the only luck Eck would ever know in command. A lone steamer, no escorts, no air cover, a fat target. Through the periscope, Eck identified her. A Greek steamer, the Peleus, 4,500 gross tons, running low and heavy with cargo. Painted in the dull grey of neutrality, she carried neither guns nor naval escort. But to Eck, she was more than a merchantman. She was a statement, proof to his superiors that U-852 could still strike deep in waters the Allies believed secure. 2 eels, he ordered quietly. The torpedo room came alive. Diesel fumes mingled with sweat as men loaded the G7E electric torpedoes into their tubes. The order was given, a hiss of compressed air. Then silence. Minutes later, a flash lit the horizon. The first torpedo struck midships, blasting steel and timber into the air. The second detonated under the stern, ripping the rudder away. The Peleus began to list immediately, her boilers venting white steam as she ground to a halt. Men scrambled across her decks, voices carrying over the water. Within 20 minutes, the Peleus slipped beneath the waves, leaving behind only wreckage and survivors clinging to rafts. The U-boat's men crowded the conning tower, watching as bodies and debris drifted on the swell. Some murmured prayers for the dead, others cheered the kill. For weeks they had endured fear and monotony. Finally, here was proof that their voyage had purpose. Eck alone was troubled. He knew the waters. By dawn, Allied patrol aircraft would be searching. The floating wreckage, the oil slick, and the survivors would betray his position. The U-boat could dive, but the evidence would remain. That night, as the stars hardened above them, Eck summoned his officers. Oberleutnant zur See August Hoffmann, the first officer, Lieutenant zur See Hans Lenz, the engineer, Bootsman Richard Reibold, the deck officer, and Dr. Walter Weispfennig, the ship's surgeon. In the cramped wardroom, under the red glow of emergency lighting, he explained his fear. If aircraft spot this wreckage tomorrow, they'll call in hunters. Destroyers, Catalinas. We'll be trapped. The sea is no longer safe for us. There was silence. Then Hoffmann spoke cautiously. We can submerge, Herr Kapitän. Wait it out. Eck shook his head. The wreckage floats. The survivors float. They'll signal. The risk is unacceptable. We must erase it. The words settled like lead in the room. Erase it. The orders. At 2200 hours, U-852 surfaced again. Searchlights probed the sea. Survivors on rafts waved frantically, believing rescue had come. Instead, machine guns were unshipped. Grenades were fetched from the magazines. Eck stood on the bridge, his face lit by the pale arc lamp, and gave the order. Fire erupted. 20mm cannon bursts tore into rafts. Grenades splashed into the water, detonating with hollow thuds that sent geysers into the night. Survivors screamed. Some leapt into the water, thrashing toward darkness. Others clung tighter to wreckage already burning from tracer fire. Crewmen on U-852 watched with horror. For years they had been told of the honour of the sea, that enemy sailors, once cast adrift, were no longer combatants but brothers in suffering. To fire upon them was unthinkable. Yet here they were, carrying out orders from a commander who insisted it was necessary for survival. Later testimony would reveal that several sailors deliberately fired wide, unwilling to strike men in the water. Others obeyed without question, hardened by propaganda and the brutalization of total war. For nearly 2 hours the attack continued. Sustained bursts of fire, grenades hurled at floating wreckage, deliberate attempts to destroy evidence of the sinking. When dawn broke on March 14th, the sea was littered with shattered rafts, splintered timber, and bodies. But not all were dead. A handful of men clung to wreckage unseen, drifting beyond the arc of the U-boat's lights. Among them was Second Officer Michalis Papadopoulos, who would later testify before Allied investigators. His words, preserved in the National Archives, remain chilling. They fired upon us until the night was over. I saw men torn apart. I saw rafts splinter under cannon shells. They wished not only to kill us, but to kill the memory of us. Only the sea saved us, carrying some beyond their lights. The survivors. Of the Peleus's crew, 35 men had taken to rafts. Only 4 survived the ordeal: Papadopoulos, First Engineer Angelos Beldakos, and 2 seamen. They drifted for over a month across the Atlantic before being rescued by a passing vessel. Emaciated, burned, their skin peeling from sun and salt, they nevertheless carried testimony that would one day condemn Eck. The survivors described not just the sinking, but the deliberate destruction of lifeboats and rafts, the systematic nature of the attack. Their accounts matched shell fragments later recovered from wreckage, evidence that would prove decisive. Life aboard after the massacre. For the crew of U-852, silence settled over the boat. Men spoke in whispers, avoided each other's eyes. The surgeon Weispfennig recorded in his diary, "We are murderers now." The men know it. They obeyed, but they do not understand. The old codes of the sea are broken. Something irrevocable has been done. Food tasted of ash. Sleep was haunted by the screams of the drowning. Some men tried to justify it. Better them than us, they argued. Others muttered prayers. A few wrote in their diaries words they dared not speak aloud. Eck himself appeared hardened. He told his officers the decision had been unavoidable. "We saved the boat," he insisted. "History will judge us as soldiers who did what was necessary." Yet his hands trembled when he lit his cigarettes. In the privacy of his cabin, he drank heavily from the schnapps reserve. The strategic context. What Eck could not know was that the act at sea had little military consequence. By 1944, the Allies already held dominance over the Atlantic. Radar, escort carriers, and ultra-intelligence had sealed the fate of the U-boat arm. The wreckage of the Peleus, had it been spotted, would have been only one among thousands. But the massacre of her survivors transformed an otherwise forgotten sinking into a war crime. Within weeks, Allied intelligence received reports of the atrocity. By chance, the Peleus's distress signal, transmitted moments before the torpedoes struck, had been intercepted by coastal stations. When survivors later confirmed the attack, British investigators compiled a case. Names were recorded, dates preserved, testimonies secured. The war was still raging, but a future tribunal was already being prepared. The capture of U-852. On April 9th, less than a month later, fate caught up with Eck. U-852, damaged and pursued, was bombed and driven aground on the Somali coast by British patrol aircraft. Eck and 61 of his crew survived to be taken prisoner. They expected interrogation, perhaps years in captivity. What they did not expect was trial. Among the documents seized from the wreck was Eck's war diary, including entries that hinted at the attack on the Peleus. Survivors' testimony, combined with physical evidence, gave Allied prosecutors their case. Unlike most U-boat captains who became prisoners of war, Eck would be singled out as a war criminal. Legacy of the Peleus affair. Historians later argued that Eck was trapped by circumstance, an inexperienced commander desperate to prove himself, a man who believed survival demanded ruthlessness. Others insisted no circumstance could excuse the deliberate killing of shipwrecked sailors. The Peleus affair became one of only 2 documented cases where U-boat officers were executed for war crimes. For the men of U-852, captivity meant more than loss of freedom. It meant carrying the memory of that night, the cries of drowning men echoing in their dreams, the knowledge that they had been ordered to betray the last code of the sea. One sailor, interviewed in 1962 at a veterans' symposium, put it bluntly. "We feared death every day, but after the Peleus we feared ourselves. No enemy could make us so hollow. Only what we did." April 1944. The net tightens. By April 1944, the Bay of Biscay and the Western Indian Ocean had become oceans of death for the U-boat arm. The once proud grey wolves of Dönitz's fleet were being slaughtered at unprecedented rates. Allied anti-submarine warfare had matured into a precise science, fusing radar, sonar, long-range patrol bombers, escort carriers, and code-breaking into an unbreakable web. U-852, under Kapitänleutnant Heinz-Wilhelm Eck, had been at sea for over 3 months. Her mission to penetrate into the Indian Ocean and disrupt Allied supply lines had already collapsed under the weight of reality. Mechanical failures plagued her engines. Fuel shortages cut her cruising range in half. Every surfacing carried the risk of immediate attack from radar-equipped patrol aircraft. And worse still, inside the hull lingered the unspoken memory of the Peleus. Men carried it in their eyes, in the silence of meals, in the way they avoided looking at their commander too long. What had been framed as survival by Eck had, in the minds of many, become murder. A moral weight pressed down on the crew with every dive, but survival still demanded discipline. On April 5th, U-852 crossed into the Western Indian Ocean, navigating near the Horn of Africa. There, the submarine hoped to find relative safety. Instead, Allied patrol squadrons, operating out of Aden and Mombasa, had extended their reach. Unbeknownst to Eck, British intelligence had tracked his approximate position, triangulating radio transmissions. The hunters were waiting. April 8, 1944, the first attack. At 2100 hours, U-852 surfaced to recharge batteries. Her diesels roared into life, sending exhaust plumes into the night sky. Radar screens on a patrolling Wellington bomber of 621 Squadron RAF, flying out of Aden, detected the faint trace. The aircraft closed in, unseen in the darkness. At 21:35, star shells lit the ocean. Seconds later, depth charges splashed into the water, detonating with thunderous force. The U-boat shook violently, lights flickered, gauges burst, pipes split. Crewmen were thrown across compartments. Eck, gripping the bridge rail, shouted for an emergency dive. U-852 descended into the blackness, the hull creaking under the sudden pressure. The Wellington circled above, dropping flares to mark the position, but contact was lost. Eck breathed again, but his reprieve was brief. The attack had torn open seams. Water seeped through the pressure hull. Electric pumps strained. The air smelled of diesel, hydraulic oil, and fear, and every man aboard knew the hunters would return. April 9th, 1944. Death from the sky. Morning brought calm seas and a pale sky. Eck ordered a cautious surface to recharge again. The diesel engines coughed into life, but Allied radar had already fixed them. At 10:20 hours, 2 Wellington Mach 14th bombers of 621 Squadron appeared on the horizon. They dove in low, engines howling, bomb bays open. Sirens wailed inside U-852. Men scrambled to battle stations, hands fumbling for the twin 20mm Oerlikons mounted on the conning tower. The sky erupted. Depth charges rained down, geysers towering over the submarine. One exploded near the stern, shattering the starboard diesel and flooding the engine room. Another ripped open ballast tanks. Fires ignited in the aft compartments. Men screamed, choking on smoke. The U-boat staggered, listing hard to port. Water poured in faster than pumps could handle. Eck, his face blackened by soot, knew the truth. The submarine was doomed. "Beach her!" he roared. The final struggle. The order sent shockwaves through the crew. To beach a U-boat meant surrender, a disgrace no commander wished to bear. Yet survival demanded it. Steering barely responsive, engines failing, U-852 limped toward the Somali coastline. The hull ground against reefs, screeching as steel tore against coral. Finally, the submarine lurched to a halt, half submerged, her bow angled grotesquely toward the sky. Smoke billowed from the wreck. Ammunition stores threatened to detonate. Eck ordered scuttling charges set, but flooding prevented access to critical areas. With the U-boat crippled, there was no choice left. Abandon ship! Men poured from hatches, dragging wounded comrades onto rafts or plunging directly into the surf. Some clutched personal diaries, others photographs, others nothing at all. The sea swallowed them, carrying men to the Somali shore, where astonished locals gathered to watch. Within hours, British patrols, guided by reconnaissance aircraft, arrived to round up the survivors. Exhausted, oil-smeared, coughing from smoke, the men of U-852 stumbled into captivity. The capture of Heinz-Wilhelm Eck. Eck was among the last to leave the wreck. He stood for a long moment on the conning tower, staring at the shattered hulk of the submarine he had once believed would carry him to glory. The Type 1XD2, pride of German engineering, now lay gutted on an African reef, her hull torn, her decks burning, her crew broken. When British soldiers approached, Eck raised his hands. His eyes, one witness later recalled, were the eyes of a man who had seen his world collapse. He surrendered without resistance. In total, 2 officers and 15 crewmen were killed during the attacks and beaching. 62 survivors, including Eck, were taken prisoner. First days in captivity. The prisoners were transported under guard to Aden, a key British base on the Arabian Peninsula. For many, it was their first glimpse of the scale of Allied logistics. They were marched past endless fuel depots, airfields crowded with patrol aircraft, docks lined with Liberty ships unloading cargo. The abundance was staggering. Private diaries from crewmen captured that shock. Everywhere fuel, everywhere planes, trucks by the hundreds. We fought for litres, they drown in oceans. Now I see the truth. We never had a chance. Eck, however, maintained a veneer of discipline. He ordered his men to stand tall, to salute British officers, to hold themselves as sailors of the Kriegsmarine. Yet in private he brooded. He knew the loss of U-852 would be judged harshly by his superiors, perhaps even as cowardice. But darker still was the memory of the Peleus. In Aden, survivors' testimony already reached British ears. Rumours spread among the German crew. Eck's decision was being investigated. Interrogation begins. In May 1944, the prisoners were formally interrogated by British intelligence officers. Standard questions, boat type, patrol route, mechanical failures were asked. Most crewmen gave little away. But Allied officers had more specific evidence, reports from Peleus survivors. When asked about the incident, Eck stiffened. He admitted to sinking the vessel but denied firing on survivors. His story was rehearsed, his tone defiant. Yet inconsistencies emerged. British interrogators pressed him with details only survivors could know: the use of grenades, the targeting of rafts. Eck faltered. His face reddened, his voice cracked. Other crewmen were called separately. Some tried to shield their commander. Others, racked with guilt, spoke halting truths. Bootsman Richard Rybold admitted reluctantly that orders had been given to destroy wreckage. Dr. Weispfennig confirmed treating sailors traumatized by the attack. Slowly, a picture emerged, fragmented but damning. The Allies had their case. Unlike most U-boat captains, whose crimes were limited to the accepted brutality of unrestricted submarine warfare, Eck had crossed a line. The weight of abundance. By late summer 1944, Eck and his men were transported to Egypt, then by ship across the Atlantic. Their destination, prisoner of war camps in the United States. The contrast was immediate. Instead of brutal conditions, they found order and abundance. At Camp Crossville in Tennessee, POWs ate full meals, 3,500 calories a day, including bread, meat, vegetables, and even desserts. Coca-Cola and candy bars were sold in PX stores. Prisoners were paid for labour, could buy cigarettes, and attended classes in English, mathematics, or engineering. For many crewmen of U-852, the experience was transformative. They compared it to the starvation in Germany, where families queued for bread and sugar was rationed to a few ounces per month. Letters home carried stories of abundance that relatives scarcely believed. But for Eck, captivity was poisoned. His men whispered about the Peleus. Allied interrogators returned again and again to the subject. Where other POWs saw hope, he saw only judgment. The shadow of the Peleus. By autumn 1944, Allied investigators had compiled a comprehensive dossier. It included survivor testimonies of the Peleus massacre, fragments of 20mm shells matching German naval ammunition, interrogation reports from U-852 crew, Eck's own diary recovered from the wreck, which contained ambiguous notes about eliminating traces. Unlike most German POWs who would remain in America until 1946 or 1947 before repatriation, Eck and a handful of officers were marked for trial. The decision was unprecedented. No U-boat commander had yet been tried for war crimes, but the Allies wanted a signal. Even in total war, there were lines that could not be crossed. For the men of U-852, the waiting became unbearable. Most blended into the POW system, working on farms, playing soccer, earning money. But Eck, Hoffman, and bootsman Matz lived in a different reality. Isolated, interrogated, their fates tied not to Germany's defeat, but to the massacre in the South Atlantic. The broader context. Eck's capture highlighted more than an individual tragedy. It revealed the collapse of Germany's grand naval ambitions. The Type 1 XD-2, once heralded as the submarine that would bring the Indian Ocean under German control, had been reduced to a beached wreck on a Somali reef. The mathematics of production told the truth. In 1944, the United States launched more Liberty ships than Germany had submarines left afloat. Allied shipyards built escort carriers faster than the Kriegsmarine could commission U-boats. Petroleum flowed in rivers across the Atlantic, while German crews rationed every litre. U-852's loss was not simply one boat among many. It was the symbolic end of Germany's attempt to expand the U-boat war beyond the Atlantic. Eck's realization. In letters smuggled from captivity, Eck maintained defiance. He insisted he had acted in military necessity, that history would absolve him. But his words carried undertones of despair. I did my duty. Others may not understand, but a commander must think of his boat first. If I am judged, I will stand as a soldier. Yet I know the world does not forgive the weak. They will call it murder. They will not see it was survival. His men, meanwhile, distanced themselves. In camp gossip, they blamed Eck for their fate. They spoke of his arrogance, his fanaticism, his blindness to the moral code of the sea. The divide between commander and crew widened, leaving Eck isolated even among his countrymen. Prelude to judgment. By early 1945, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and Germany collapsed, preparations for post-war justice accelerated. The Peleus affair was classified as a priority case. British legal officers gathered evidence, interviewed survivors again, and prepared charges. Eck's name was entered into history not alongside Dönitz or Prien, but in the darker company of commanders accused of crimes against humanity. He was to become the only U-boat commander executed for war crimes, a man whose career began with ambition and ended with dishonor. The first questions. Aden, May 1944. The prisoners of U-852, exhausted from the destruction of their submarine and the chaos of their capture, arrived in Aden under heavy guard. For most of the crew, the transition was surreal. Only days before, they had been sealed inside a steel coffin, rationing air, water, and hope. Now they were herded into barracks, issued blankets, and given food, real food, hot and plentiful. For Eck, the contrast was harder to bear. He had walked off the wreck of his U-boat with the bearing of a captain, expecting to be treated as an officer of the Kriegsmarine. Instead, he was immediately separated from his men, led to an office where a British intelligence officer waited with pen and notebook. The first interrogations were polite, almost casual. Name, rank, service number. Date of birth, last port of call, patrol orders. The British already knew much of this from ultra-decrypts and captured records. What they wanted was confirmation, and something more. When the officer asked about the sinking of the Peleus, Eck stiffened. His jaw clenched. He gave the barest of answers. A Greek steamer. Sunk by torpedo. No further details. But the officer pressed, his tone calm, almost conversational. What became of the survivors? Eck's eyes narrowed. I saw none. The officer made a note. He did not argue. He simply nodded, closed the file and said, "Thank you, Captain. We will talk again." Eck walked back to his quarters with unease gnawing at him. How could they know? The ocean was vast. Survivors, if any, would never have lived, and yet the questions had been precise. The case builds. While Eck brooded, British investigators were already compiling a case. In Freetown, Sierra Leone, the 4 survivors of the Peleus, Papadopoulos, Beldikos, and 2 seamen, had been rescued after weeks adrift. Their testimonies were chillingly consistent. U-852 had not merely sunk their ship, but had deliberately destroyed lifeboats, fired on survivors, and hurled grenades into the water. The survivors described the distinctive silhouette of a Type 9 U-boat, its deck gun, its conning tower markings. They remembered the sound of machine guns, the flash of grenades. They could even identify details of the German uniforms. Their statements were forwarded to London, and copies reached Aden before Eck had finished his first week in captivity. British officers compared these reports with fragments of wreckage recovered from the scene, splintered rafts embedded with 20mm shell casings of German origin. Together with Eck's evasive answers, the evidence began to form a damning mosaic. Crew interrogations. The Allies understood that the quickest way to break through silence was to separate men from their commander. At Aden, and later in Cairo, U-852's crew were questioned individually. Some were loyal, repeating the official line. They had seen no survivors, destroyed no rafts, fired no weapons. But cracks appeared quickly. Bootsman Richard Rybold, a seasoned petty officer, admitted under pressure that they had been ordered to fire on debris. He insisted he had aimed wide, never striking a man, but the admission was enough. Dr. Walter Weispfennig, the boat's surgeon, confirmed treating men afterward who were shaken, even nauseous, at what they had been ordered to do. In his diary, seized from his cabin, investigators found an entry written after the incident. "We are murderers now." The men obeyed, but their souls are not at peace. I do not know how we will live with it. Such words, written in private, carried more weight than any testimony under duress. Eck's defiance. Eck's own interrogations grew more hostile. British officers presented him with fragments of testimony. Survivors said you fired on them. What do you say? Crewmen claim you gave the order. How do you respond? Eck denied everything. He insisted he had acted as a professional officer, sinking an enemy vessel according to the laws of war. He dismissed survivor accounts as propaganda, his crew's statements as misunderstandings. But in private, his composure faltered. Guards noticed him pacing his cell late into the night, smoking endlessly. Letters he attempted to write home, censored by British officials, were filled with bitterness. They accuse me of crimes. They do not understand what it means to command at sea. A commander makes choices for survival. They will never understand. His men, meanwhile, began to distance themselves. In camp gossip, whispers spread. The captain will hang for Peleus. Some blamed him openly, saying he had sacrificed their honour. Others pitied him, believing he had panicked and made a terrible mistake. Transfer to the United States. By mid-1944, U-852's crew, like thousands of other German POWs, were shipped across the Atlantic. For most, the journey was astonishing. They were fed 3 meals a day, provided bunks with mattresses, even given cigarettes. Some recalled being served ice cream aboard the transport, an extravagance unimaginable in wartime Germany. In Camp Crossville, Tennessee, and later at Camp Aliceville, Alabama, the men settled into routines, working on farms, attending classes, playing soccer against American guards. They wrote home about Coca-Cola for 5 cents, candy bars for a nickel, abundant food on every table. For them, captivity became an education in American abundance. But for Eck, the experience was poisoned. While his crew integrated into camp life, He remained under special scrutiny. Interrogators visited regularly. British and American legal officers compiled more evidence. He knew he was marked, not for repatriation after the war, but for trial. The POW divide. The contrast between Eck's fate and that of ordinary German POWs could not have been sharper. At Camp Aliceville, prisoners enjoyed music concerts, lectures, and Red Cross packages filled with chocolate and coffee. They earned wages for farm labour, enough to buy luxuries at the PX. Many later testified that they had never eaten so well in their lives. Some even began to question Nazi propaganda. How could a society supposedly weak and decadent afford to feed its enemies better than Germany fed its soldiers? For these men, captivity was transformative. They returned home after 1946, speaking of democracy, abundance, and possibility. But Eck never shared this transformation. He was avoided by his men, shunned in the mess halls, whispered about as the murderer. Guards noted his isolation, his bitterness. Unlike others who marvelled at Coca-Cola, Eck brooded over legal documents, awaiting the inevitable summons. The legal machinery. In London, legal officers prepared for the coming reckoning. The Allies had determined that beyond the Nuremberg leadership trials, individual cases of war crimes would be prosecuted to demonstrate that the laws of war applied universally. The Pellias affair, with its survivor testimony and clear evidence, was chosen as a test case. Documents captured from U-852 were translated and catalogued. Survivor statements were sworn before judges. Crew testimonies were preserved. A complete dossier, marked Eck, Heinz-Wilhelm, Pellias Incident, circulated between London and Washington. By early 1945, the decision was made. Eck and a handful of his officers would be returned to Europe to stand trial before a British military tribunal. The collapse of the Reich. As Germany crumbled in spring 1945, news filtered into the camps. American newspapers showed photographs of concentration camps, of endless columns of American tanks, of German cities reduced to rubble. For most POWs, the realization was crushing. The Reich had fallen, the war was lost. Yet many also felt relief. They had survived. They had food, health, even opportunities for learning. They would return to families with stories of abundance and decency. Eck alone awaited something different. In April 1945, as Hitler died in Berlin, British officers informed him that he would be transferred back to Europe, not for repatriation, but for trial. Isolation. In the weeks before departure, Eck's isolation grew complete. Guards observed him sitting alone, staring at the camp fences for hours. He rarely spoke, even to his fellow officers Hoffmann and Matz, who faced the same charges. When he did, it was with bitterness. They will never understand. They will say murder because they have never commanded. They do not know what it means to fear discovery, to fear the sea itself. They will judge me as a criminal, but I was a captain. His men, meanwhile, embraced captivity. Some learned English. Others took classes in mechanics, agriculture, even philosophy. Letters home spoke of the kindness of American civilians, of Christmas packages from church groups, of turkeys and pumpkin pie on Thanksgiving. The divide was total. For them, captivity was survival. For Eck, it was a waiting room before judgment. In late summer 1945, Eck and his co-defendants were flown to Europe under guard. They were taken to Hamburg, where a British military tribunal had been established to prosecute war crimes. The trial would begin in October. The case was already famous in legal circles. It was the first time a U-boat commander would be tried not for sinking ships, but for his actions against survivors. The precedent was clear. Even in total war there were rules, and Eck had broken them. Late summer 1944, the Liberty ship creaked across the Atlantic swells, her holds packed not with cargo, but with prisoners of war. Among them sat the survivors of U-852, Germany's most infamous U-boat crew. They had been taken first to Aden, then through the Suez Canal, across the Mediterranean, and finally loaded for transport to the United States. For most of the Germans, the voyage itself was a revelation. They were fed 3 meals a day, bread still soft, meat with fat on it, vegetables boiled but plentiful. Guards offered cigarettes, sometimes even candy. Prisoners were shocked when American sailors casually discarded half-eaten apples or poured out untouched coffee. To men who had rationed every scrap aboard their submarine, such waste was incomprehensible. Kapitänleutnant Heinz-Wilhelm Eck, however, sat apart. He smoked endlessly, pacing the deck when allowed above, staring at the limitless ocean with the look of a man already condemned. Where his men murmured in wonder at the abundance, Eck's eyes narrowed in resentment. He saw not generosity, but arrogance, an enemy so rich it could drown in its own excess. When the U-852 prisoners disembarked in New York, they were transported south by train in Pullman coaches, cushioned seats, windows with curtains, even dining cars serving full meals. For Germans accustomed to cattle cars, it was a shock bordering on humiliation. "We are prisoners, yet treated as tourists," one sailor wrote in his diary. Their destination was Camp Crossville, Tennessee, one of dozens of POW camps spread across America. Spread over hundreds of acres, surrounded by barbed wire but equipped with barracks, kitchens, workshops, and even a theatre, it was a far cry from the prison camps Germans had imagined. On their first evening, the prisoners were issued mattresses, blankets, and clean uniforms marked PW. Dinner included roast chicken, potatoes, vegetables, bread, and coffee with sugar. Dessert followed, apple pie. For men who had survived on mouldy black bread and ersatz coffee at sea, it was a banquet. "Americans feed their enemies better than Germany feeds her soldiers," one astonished machinist whispered. His comrades nodded in silence, forks suspended halfway to their mouths. The Camp PX, post-exchange, became the heart of POW life. Stocked with Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Dr. Pepper, Hershey bars, Mars bars, Lucky Strikes, and even fresh fruit, it offered prisoners a taste of a world they had only seen in advertisements. With wages earned from camp labour, 80 cents a day, later raised to $1, POWs could buy 16 bottles of soda or candy bars daily. Records show that in the summer of 1944, Crossville alone sold thousands of bottles of Coca-Cola weekly to prisoners. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, the number reached nearly 7,000 bottles a week, deliveries arriving in neat red crates stamped with the familiar white script. For Germans who had never tasted such a drink before capture, it was intoxicating. Ice cream appeared regularly in mess halls, especially in the summer. Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, sometimes butter pecan. Army procurement records confirm that larger camps ordered 50 to 100 gallons weekly. Germans who had not seen ice cream since before the war now ate it casually, sometimes twice a week. Sugar, too, was abundant. In Germany, civilians received 280 grams a month, when available. In American camps, sugar sat openly on mess tables, prisoners free to spoon as much as they wanted into coffee or over cereal. One sailor wrote home, "They throw away sugar here when it hardens." In Germany, we would guard it like gold. For ordinary U-852 crewmen, these experiences were transformative. They had been raised on Nazi propaganda that portrayed America as decadent, weak, incapable of sacrifice. Instead, they found a society so rich in resources that it could feed its enemies better than Germany fed its children. American camps were not merely warehouses for prisoners, they were classrooms. The War Department, hoping to re-educate Germans through exposure to democratic values, organized lectures, language classes, and even vocational training. At Aliceville, German professors in captivity gave courses on mathematics, literature, and philosophy. At Crossville, a library stocked with English and German books allowed POWs to study everything from Shakespeare to technical manuals. Some learned English, others agriculture or mechanics. For younger sailors of U-852, these programs opened worlds. They attended lectures on American history, discovered democratic ideals in books, and debated politics in barracks late into the night. The abundance of books and the freedom to question stood in stark contrast to the rigid indoctrination they had grown up under in Nazi Germany. Letters home carried strange new ideas. The Americans are not weak. They are strong because they are free, one prisoner wrote in 1945. They have no fear of opinion, no fear of abundance. Perhaps our leaders were wrong. Yet Eck remained apart. He attended no lectures, read no books beyond military manuals, and declined to join sports or music evenings. His rank set him above ordinary sailors, but his reputation pushed him below them. Whispers circulated in the barracks. The captain ordered it. He made us fire on the rafts. Others called him Murder Kapitän, the murderer captain. Even those who had obeyed his orders now shunned him, unwilling to share in the guilt that hung around his shoulders like a shroud. When Allied officers visited to question him, Eck walked stiffly, chin high, but guards reported him pacing alone for hours afterward, muttering to himself. Where others gained weight in captivity, astonishing doctors by returning healthier than when captured, Eck grew gaunt, chain-smoking and refusing much of the food offered. The very abundance that transformed his men only deepened his alienation. To them, Coca-Cola and Hershey bars symbolized possibility. To Eck, they symbolized defeat, proof that Germany had never truly understood the enemy it had challenged. The cultural shocks deepened during holidays. On Thanksgiving 1944, German prisoners sat down to roast turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, and milk. Army records confirm that the same meal was served to American soldiers worldwide, with POWs included in the distribution. For many Germans, it was the most extravagant meal they had ever eaten. Christmas brought even greater astonishment. Packages from American civilians, church groups, civic organizations, even school children, arrived at camps addressed simply to German prisoners of war. They contained cookies, candy, games, soap, even cigarettes. At Camp Hearn in Texas, townspeople delivered homemade Christmas cookies to German prisoners. At Aliceville, the American Friends Service Committee distributed 50,000 packages to POWs, including those from U-852. Prisoners wept openly, unable to comprehend why their enemies would show kindness. For most, these gestures began dismantling years of propaganda. Nazi Germany had promised strength through cruelty. America demonstrated strength through abundance and mercy. But for Eck, these holidays were torment. He attended dinners in silence, staring at plates piled high with food he could not bring himself to eat. He refused gifts, turning away volunteers who offered cookies or books. Where others felt gratitude, he felt humiliation. By 1945, as labour shortages gripped the United States, German POWs were increasingly employed outside camps. Over 100,000 worked in agriculture and food processing. Prisoners from U-852 found themselves in orchards, canneries, and sugar beet fields. They marvelled at the abundance, orchards producing tons of cherries destined only for garnishes, canneries rejecting edible fruit for minor blemishes, farms producing more sugar beets than entire German provinces. They saw American schoolchildren served hot lunches with milk and vegetables, sometimes even ice cream. They saw factory workers and bank managers eat identical meals in diners, both paying the same nickel for Coca-Cola. For the ordinary sailors, these experiences were revelatory. They began to see that American abundance was not propaganda, but lived reality, built on industrial capacity Germany could never match. Eck, however, was never permitted outside camp fences. His status as a war crimes suspect ensured close confinement. He heard second-hand of these experiences but never saw them. He remained locked in a world of interrogation rooms and guarded walks, watching abundance from a distance. In spring 1945, news of Germany's collapse swept through the camps. Prisoners read American newspapers, saw photographs of Hitler's bunker, of concentration camps liberated by Allied forces, of German cities reduced to rubble. For most, the news brought grief, but also relief. Their families would suffer, but the war was over. Many now hoped to return home to rebuild, carrying with them knowledge of abundance, democracy, and industrial possibility. But for Eck, the news meant only one thing. The Reich that might have shielded him was gone. There would be no reprieve from Berlin, no intervention by Dönitz, no protective cloak of victory. His fate now lay entirely in Allied hands. By late 1945, the gulf between Eck and his crew had become complete. Ordinary sailors gained weight, studied English, played soccer, and began to think of life after captivity. Some even volunteered to help American farmers plant or harvest, earning money to send home. Their memories of war softened under the weight of Coca-Cola bottles and Thanksgiving turkeys. Eck remained the outcast. Even Hoffman and Matz, his fellow officers accused alongside him, withdrew into themselves, speaking little. In the eyes of other POWs, Eck carried a stain that tainted all who stood too near. American guards noted the difference. "The others act like regular men now," one sergeant wrote. "Eck is different. He walks like he's already dead." In September 1945, Allied officers informed Eck and his co-defendants they would be transferred back to Europe. Not for repatriation, but for trial in Hamburg. The news hit the camp like a thunderclap. For the majority of German POWs, 1945 marked the beginning of hope, the expectation that within a year or two they would go home. For Eck and his men, it marked the beginning of the end. The experience of German POWs in America revealed the profound power of abundance. Coca-Cola, ice cream, sugar, and kindness did what propaganda could not. They dismantled myths of American weakness and reshaped minds. Thousands returned to Germany as witnesses of democracy's strength, carrying stories of abundance that would shape West Germany's post-war recovery. But Heinz-Wilhelm Eck stood apart. Where others tasted freedom in Coca-Cola, he tasted humiliation. Where others gained weight, he withered. Where others planned for life, he awaited trial. In the end, the American camps revealed the two paths open to Germany's defeated: transformation through abundance or condemnation through guilt. Most chose the former. Eck, bound by his choices on the night of March 13, 1944, could only face the latter. The Reich in ruins. May 1945. Across Europe, the 1,000-year Reich ended not with triumph, but with silence and rubble. Berlin fell under Soviet guns, Hitler dead in his bunker, Dönitz surrendering what remained of the Kriegsmarine at Flensburg. The swastika, once raised above half a continent, now lay trampled in the ruins of its own cities. For German prisoners in America, the news spread quickly through camp loudspeakers and newspapers. Some wept quietly in their bunks. Others stared blankly at headlines announcing unconditional surrender. But mingled with grief came relief. The war was over. They had survived. For most, the surrender marked the beginning of hope. They spoke of returning to families, of rebuilding homes, of planting crops and finding work. Their captivity, softened by American abundance, had prepared them for survival in peace. But for Heinz-Wilhelm Eck, the surrender was not liberation. It was the removal of the last shield between him and judgment. While others imagined reunions, he faced only the march toward trial. In the summer of 1945, camps across the United States celebrated Allied victory. Prisoners were served special meals: steaks, vegetables, cakes frosted in patriotic colors. American guards offered extra rations of cigarettes and Coca-Cola. For ordinary POWs, these feasts confirmed what they had already begun to suspect. America was not weak, but infinitely strong, able to fight a global war and still celebrate with abundance. Men wrote home about oceans of food, about ice cream factories running just for soldiers, about children in America who ate chocolate while German children starved. For Eck, every bottle of Coca-Cola was a reminder of defeat, every slice of cake a taunt. He ate in silence, his face drawn, eyes fixed not on the plate before him, but on the inevitable future that awaited in Hamburg. Through the Red Cross, POWs received letters from families in Germany. Most were filled with desperation, tales of bombed cities, empty shops, children crying for bread. Some men read aloud, their voices breaking as they shared news of wives and parents barely surviving in the ruins. But alongside despair came small miracles. Families reported receiving food parcels sent from America by prisoners, chocolate, canned goods, instant coffee. To German civilians, these packages seemed like gifts from another world. They began to ask how it was possible that their imprisoned sons and husbands could send food from captivity while free citizens starved. This contradiction shattered what remained of Nazi propaganda. The regime had promised victory through sacrifice. America demonstrated prosperity through production. Eck, however, sent no parcels. His wages were meagre, his privileges restricted by his status as a war crimes suspect. His family, like millions of Germans, starved in bombed cities. He could offer them nothing but silence. By August 1945, with Japan defeated and the World War truly over, the Allies turned their full attention to justice. The Nuremberg trials prepared to prosecute the architects of Nazi aggression. But beyond the great leaders, individual cases were chosen to demonstrate that the laws of war applied at every level. The Pelias massacre was selected as one such case. The evidence was clear. Survivor testimony, physical proof, captured diaries, and corroborating statements from crew. Eck's name was entered onto the list of defendants to face trial before a British military tribunal in Hamburg. For him, the collapse of the Reich sealed fate. No rescue would come. No government remained to protect him. The U-boat arm was finished, its legacy tarnished by desperate atrocities. He would stand alone. By late 1945, American camps began releasing prisoners for repatriation. Groups boarded ships back to Europe, carrying with them memories of abundance. They returned healthier than when captured, some even heavier, while their families had wasted away at home. The men of U-852 watched as fellow prisoners departed. Laughter echoed in barracks as men packed belongings, wrote final letters, and dreamed of reunion. For them, captivity had been a strange education in democracy and plenty. They would return to a devastated homeland carrying stories of Coca-Cola, ice cream, and Thanksgiving feasts. But Eck and a handful of officers remained behind wire, their names marked with a black cross on camp rosters, held for war crimes. Their fate was exile not into freedom, but into judgment. In September 1945, guards informed Eck and his co-defendants, Hoffmann, Matz, Reibold, and Weispfennig, that they would be transferred back to Europe. Not as free men, but as prisoners bound for trial. Escorted under heavy guard, they boarded transport planes. The journey east mirrored their earlier voyage west, but the tone was inverted. Where once they had seen America's abundance with bitterness, now they saw it for the last time. Fields of corn stretching to the horizon, cities glowing with electric lights, trains carrying endless coal and steel. It was the abundance that had defeated them, the abundance they had never believed real until they saw it with their own eyes. Eck said little during the journey. He smoked constantly, staring out of windows at the land rolling below. To one guard he muttered, "This is why we lost. You have oceans of everything. We had drops. The collapse of the Reich freed millions but condemned a few. For German prisoners of war in America, it meant survival, transformation, and eventual return. They had seen a world their leaders had denied existed, a world where democracy produced abundance and kindness could coexist with power. For Heinz-Wilhelm Eck, the collapse meant the end of illusions. He could no longer imagine rescue, no longer dream of vindication. His Reich was rubble, his U-boat a wreck, his name forever tied to a massacre in the South Atlantic. The war had ended, but for Eck, the true battle, his reckoning, was about to begin.